I drank a papa dobble and sat at Captain Tony's thinking about life. Hundreds of signed bras hanging from the ceiling say everything about the atmosphere of the place. The building itself was everything from a glacier to a bad place. The current incarnation dates back to the days of Hemingway. The place was originally called Sloppy Joe's, but the landlord raised the annual rent by $1. So the owner moved the entire saloon, along with the name, down Green Street to its present location. Legend has it that Hemingway stayed in the original building, which was eventually named after Tony Terracino, who was an even more prominent Key West figure than Ernie. Legend also claims that Martha Gellhorn paid a bartender $20 to meet Hemingway there. This led to a whirlwind romance while they both covered the Spanish Civil War. And this affair led to the end of Hemingway's marriage to his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, who in turn stole him from his first wife, Hadley Richardson. So it's clear that the 1960s didn't invent adultery. I lived on my boat, which was moored at Conch Harbor Marina. I chose this location because my usual drinking establishments on Duval Street were easily accessible on foot or sometimes even crawled. The boat itself is a C and C40, which is quite a lot for solo sailing. But I'm an excellent sailor and wanted more space. I brought her down the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway 3 years ago, and unless there was a Cuban invasion, I planned to stay put. My buddy Buster was my only companion. He was also my best friend. He weighs about 120 pounds and looks like his previous job was guarding the gates of hell. But he is incredibly sweet, gentle, and loving behind his scary exterior. The best thing about my big stinky buddy is that he will never leave me. I can't say that about any of the women in my life. It all started at one of the elite universities in the Midwest. I didn't get there because I was rich or smart. I got there because I was very fast in the water. I'd rather be great at any other sport. But unfortunately, I was a fish. So I spent hours marinating in bleach, building long, smooth muscles that made me lean, not powerful. I was not a lion. I was a sea lion. And since the sport of swimming requires extreme physical endurance, I had to spend all my waking hours moving up and down the pool until some sadist shouted insults at me. He called it training. I must admit that sports ensured the absence of excess fat, but at 6 feet 4 inches, I was built more like a human torpedo than a Greek god. And since the goal was to reduce drag, I actually invented the shaved head as well. Needless to say, I was not chosen as king at the ball, and even going on a date was difficult. Scholarship athletes lived in the same dorm, and by luck, I ended up with a football player. This is my life. I could have a neighbor who is a swimmer, or a football player, or a gymnast, or anyone other than an arrogant asshole. Brad wasn't difficult to handle. That's because he spent his days hanging around the local fraternity with his fellow Neanderthals. But when he was in the room, he treated me like uncomfortable furniture. I especially liked the nights when he decided to sleep. Very early in our acquaintance, he informed me that if his tie was hanging on the door, I should not enter. So most nights I sat and studied in the common room until 2 a.m. while moans and screams echoed down the hallway. And then I could fall asleep to the constant smell of sex. His argument was that he would do the same for me, which was funny because I had never experienced this pleasure. Like I said, being a lanky human torpedo has its downsides to the sexual experience. I've had a few girls come out to me condescendingly, but there were rarely second dates. I wasn't subtle, and I had nothing to recommend other than the fact that I was a scholarship athlete. The problem was that I was in a sport that was everything but glamorous. Every Saturday afternoon, Brad, who was the varsity quarterback, did heroic things in front of 100,000 screaming fans. You watch swimming every 4 years at the Olympics. This mainly includes people standing around, and it usually attracts as many spectators as cycling. Plus, the only thing anyone sees is the splash of water and the occasional sight of a face desperately gasping for air. Maybe you can see why Brad had a lot of hot co-eds, and my romantic moments were limited to my hand. The only good thing about my situation was that I was never under the illusion that I would do anything other than work after college. Swimming was simply a means to an end, so I studied hard while Brad spent time socially. Brad thought about the millions he was going to make in the NFL. No wonder he ended up selling life insurance. Towards the end of my junior season, I returned from the library, and there was a regular tie. I had a swim the next day, and I was not in the mood, so I knocked on the door. The urgent moaning stopped, and a few seconds later, I heard Brad shout, "I'm busy. Go away." I was furious, so I yelled back, "I have a swim tomorrow, and I need to get some sleep. Take it somewhere else. You have 5 minutes." I heard a questioning female voice and some grumbling from him, but it seemed like they were going to pack up their things and leave. So I just leaned against the wall and waited. Disheveled does not begin to describe what happened. Brad gave me an annoyed look. I didn't care. I'm half a head taller than him, so it was never a matter of physical intimidation. I said as sarcastically as possible, "Thank you," and began to enter the room. That's when I really looked at the person he was having sex with. Most of Brad's conquests are ordinary college girls and football groupies. They roam the campus in herds. Each one is hot, but their faces tend to blend into a universal, blurred beauty. It was a completely different breed. She had thick coppery hair that disappeared down her back in healthy waves. The absolutely perfect condition of her hair was surprising in itself, considering the fact that 5 minutes ago she was actively having sex. I think it was in her eyes. I'm not usually a fan of pure redheads. This milky skin and all these freckles scare me. But when I looked into her gorgeous emerald eyes, there was real fire and intelligence there. She almost seemed cheerful. She nodded at me appraisingly. She and my roommate then performed the archetypal walk of shame to the elevator. I was sure my neighbor was heading to Plan B, the fraternity of athletes. I fell asleep to the familiar smell of sex. It was more disturbing than usual, but I almost felt jealous of the idiot. I didn't encounter her again until the last few days of that semester. I was at a classic frat beer party. I was at a classic frat kegger. I lived in a dormitory because I received a scholarship. But fraternities like to show off university athletes. Needless to say, these were minor fraternities. No prestigious sports houses, no arrogant fraternities where my best people hung out. I stood in my usual party position, that is, holding my back to the wall. I had one of those 16-ounce solo cups filled with a yellow, frothy substance that I prayed was beer. It was hard to say. She came in with some rats. I only glanced at her as she and my neighbor left the building, but I was impressed by her twitching buns. Now that I had the opportunity to fully test it, I was shocked. She was great. But then again, most of the college girls you see at a college party are generally attractive. However, something about this manner made her different. She exuded complete self-confidence and absolute femininity in the way she walked and carried herself. Then she started dancing with the dude. She was only about 5 feet 2 inches tall, but she had unusually muscular legs and very narrow, round hips. Otherwise, she was lithe and youthful, but it was that perfectly proportioned face and sparkling green eyes that hypnotized me. A tougher guy might have stepped up and tried to intervene, but I'm socially retarded, hence my little virginity problem. So I just stood there and looked at her. I believe that women are equipped with some kind of special antenna that tells them when they are being scanned. In any case, she looked up warily, as if she sensed something, and looked straight at me. I didn't look into the typical empty eyes of a student. She knew exactly what she was doing. She looked like a cat playing with a mouse. Something ran across her face. I'm sure she's used to being stared at, so it wasn't a matter of gaping. But I had the feeling that I had disturbed her. I'm not socially prepared to deal with angry women. If she was going to anger me, I would get out of there. So I left the main room and sat on a chair in the small side room. Later in the evening, this room turns into a kissing place, so it gets dark. The only light came from the open door. The night was still young, so at that moment it was just me and my beer. I was trying to decide what my next move should be when she poked her head around the corner. I got the impression that she was looking for someone, perhaps her companion. There is no such luck. I sat there and did my best lone wolf imitation when she noticed me. She then very purposefully walked over to confront me. I got up from the sofa. It was a defensive move. She stood in front of me in a classic aggressive female pose, legs apart, hands on hips slightly extended towards me. She silently looked me up and down. It was actually quite funny. I was a full 14 inches taller than her, so she examined me as if she were assessing a horse. I half expected her to open my mouth and count my teeth. Not a word was said. Then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing and gawking. I was completely amazed by the strength and spirit in those eyes. Finally, I pulled myself together and followed her. But when I entered the main room, she returned and had sex with her companion. I headed home. I've never met a woman who bothered me so much. I mostly go with the flow, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. So the next day, I asked Brad. I said, I met that hot redhead girl you had last month. What's her story? He laughed and said, she's ugly. This is her story. I said, freak? What do you mean by that? She is strange. He said in his usual dismissive tone, any woman who isn't grateful after I fucked her is a freak. When we were together, she was a real animal. Then, when I asked her for a rematch, she completely pushed me away. It felt like I was bothering her. Since this is how Brad feels about all of his conquests, I wasn't sure who beat whom. I asked, do you know her name? He said, Kari Winter, but you won't stand a chance with her. I said, why not? I know I'm not you, but I've dated random women. I was lying, of course. He said, because she only dates great guys like me, not idiots like you, no offense. I said, nothing taken. What could I say? Brad was a vain asshole. I'd rather argue with an orangutan. He said, she's probably had sex with 8 guys I know besides me, and everyone says she's the hottest ass they've ever had. She's completely out of your league. I smiled sardonically and said, just asking. And I classified Miss Kari Winter among the large pile of women I knew to be avoided at all costs. At the beginning of my senior year, I was training for the 200-meter dash, which was definitely not my best event. As usual, I looked at the sparse crowd. And who should I see there besides Kari Winter? She waved her hand. I started off false. In fact, I more or less fell face first into the pool. After that ignominious start, I climbed the blocks again and set personal, pool, and conference records. I knew what the motivation was, but there was no way I was going to admit it. Of course, later that evening I had to acknowledge her presence. I left the locker room and she was standing there. I'm not completely stupid. I knew I would have to say something, so I approached her. She turned and walked away before I got there. Turning to leave, she said over her shoulder, "Follow me." There was no question that I would not follow her. She was wearing faded jeans that probably cost $300 to shed tears in the right place. The most strategic were the 4-inch horizontal rips, right where her big round butt cheeks met her muscular legs. I followed him, watching these breaks move up and down. It was hypnotic. We walked to a small decorative park between 2 hostels. She reached a secluded bench and sat down. I walked over and stood in front of her. It was one of the inexpressibly beautiful evenings of early autumn in Michigan. It's still warm, a light breeze carries the aroma of burning leaves. I heard grasshoppers and crickets chirping busily in the well-kept bushes and smelled the freshly turned earth beneath them. I looked at her questioningly. She said, "Sit down, we need to talk." I looked at her even more questioningly and said, genuinely puzzled, "Why?" I knew that this woman belonged to campus royalty. Anyone who's ever been to college knows what I'm talking about. 20 students knew her name. Every woman wanted to be like her, and every man just wanted to have her. I sat down. She said reproachfully, "Do you like men?" I exploded, "What? Of course not." She said, "Then why didn't you try to hit on me? Why didn't you ask me out on a date?" This conversation was a waste of time. I got straight to the point. I said, "Women like you don't date guys like me. You're miles above me, and we both know it. So why would I give you the opportunity to turn me down?" She looked disgusted and said, "It's up to me to decide, not you. What makes you think I wouldn't want to go with you? I've been attracted to you since the moment we first met. Okay, so where is the camera?" I knew I was in an episode of Punk'd. Neither Kutcher nor Goldberg came out of the bushes. Kari just kept talking. She said, "I assume you know my reputation. The dumbass you live with must have told you about me. I'll admit, I've kissed a lot of frogs in the last 4 years, and I haven't found a single prince yet. Just randy frat guys and jocks. I was hoping you would be different." She really looked vulnerable. It must have been an optical illusion. I said, "Brad is a well-known dumbass. I wouldn't listen to a word he said. But I also know that you are considered the hottest girl on campus. You could have any guy from 18 to 80 in the 3 neighboring counties. So what is it about me that interests you so much?" My tone was ultra-skeptical. She said, "You're a sports star, but you don't seem to know it. You spend your time in the library getting ready for life, not at parties. You're tall and handsome, and I like completely bald men." She said the latter with a cat-like smile. I knew that everyone behind my back called me Bald Eagle because of my big nose and shaved head. She added, "What's not to like about it?" Well, it was a surprising state of affairs. I said, "Let me get this straight. You want to try a real date because you find me interesting. I know this sounds a little uncertain, but I still don't believe what I'm hearing." She looked at me appraisingly and said ironically, "And the boy is wonderfully insecure." I looked at her carefully. From her head to her thick copper hair to the tips of her bright red nails, this woman was a movie star. Despite her legendary performances in bed, she was also clearly smart, confident, and very comfortable in her perfect skin. With all these advantages, the only question was, why me? She looked at me with curiosity, as if expecting an answer. So I thought, stop being such a coward and just ask her out. I pulled myself together and said, "Okay, let's go on a date. I'll pick you up tomorrow and we'll taste it. But I warn you that as soon as you don't show me the respect I deserve, I will take you home." She said, a little annoyed, "Respect? What does that mean?" I said, "You know what I'm talking about. They will try to seduce you many times while we are together tomorrow. When that happens, I want you to remember that you are with me." She really looked impressed. She said, "So no flirting or attracting other men, I promise." And she gave me a playful smile. I picked her up at her apartment the next evening. She had rich parents, so she lived in an off-campus apartment by herself. I didn't want to think about the events that could have happened in that place. I wish I could do a happy dance instead of burning with jealousy even before I rang her bell. She met me at the door. She was wearing a little club dress that would have looked modest on my sister, but the way she looked in it evoked indescribable waves of desire in me. She wasn't buxom, but what she had looked full and neatly gathered into 2 beautiful little mounds on her chest. However, her long waist and flexible round hips and perfect muscular legs were all anyone could notice, and the dress showed off her assets without looking the least bit vulgar. Her 4-inch heels only made those legs look more rounded and fuller. But of course, it was her face and those eyes that fascinated me. She said lightly, "Are you going to stand there and stare, or are we leaving?" I said, "We're leaving, but you're incredibly beautiful." She smiled God. She even had cute dimples. She grabbed her little purse, and we left. What can you say about the evening when you meet the one? We talked all the way to the restaurant. It turned out that she was the daughter of 2 lawyers from Los Angeles and was at the university to complete her law school coursework. She also turned out to be very smart, intellectually curious, and had an amazing sense of humor. She said she dated people like Brad because they were the only guys who asked her out. Unfortunately, I could understand what she was saying. I'm an ordinary guy, and I would never dare approach a woman like her, let alone date her. She said that any guy she went on a date with got one chance, and if they weren't interesting or smart enough, that was it, which explained her one-time date with Brad. She said that date with Brad was not a frequent one, but it happened, which led her to increase her score with local handsome men. I didn't believe a single word. It sounded like rationalization. So I said, "Do you always have them on the first date?" I was a jerk, but I was sure I would never see her again. She looked a little hurt and said, "I know it seems that way, but I could go on dates every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Brad is delicious, and he is very persistent. Plus, I was drunk. I never have sex with him otherwise. He's just not a good fit mentally. I didn't even think about going on a second date with him." I somehow understood all this. Kari was just so attractive, and it was hot. This was visible in her every movement. Her sensuality was obvious, even in the simple things she did, from the way she got into the car to the way she held the menu at dinner. Many women are sex neutral or don't like it. Kari radiated complete mastery of the arts of love, and there was nothing in the act of sex that scared her. She was extremely confident. I could understand why less fortunate women would want to burn her at the stake. It was obvious to both of us that we were connecting on many levels. She was such a pleasant companion that her extreme beauty and sexuality quickly faded into the background. We were both dedicated to our studies. We both had a long-term view of life. We cared about serious things, and most importantly, Kari loved to laugh. She was openly passionate in the way she enjoyed every aspect of life. I couldn't have asked for an evening with a better friend or a more interesting companion, and for a brief moment I believed she felt the same way. That was until Rayford Johnson came to our table. He was the epitome of a fraternity brother, the alpha dog of the pack of narcissistic, overconfident assholes that populated this university. And he made it obvious that he had a long and very sweaty history with Kari. He walked up to our table with a grin and, without looking at me, said, "Hey, Kari, we're having a party at the house tonight, and a lot of guys will be happy to see you there." I don't need to be clairvoyant to read between the lines. I almost lost my mind. She glanced at me quickly, secretly, then looked at him with bewilderment, as if she could not remember him. Finally, she pretended to have an idea, slapped her forehead, and said, "Oh yes, your name is Ray, isn't it? What makes you think I'd want to waste my time on guys in your stupid fraternity, Ray? When can I be with a real man? Ray, meet Danny." I stood up to shake his hand. One of my advantages is my height, and I was taller than him by half a head and heavier by 30 pounds, enough to look impressive. I extended my hand in a friendly gesture and said, "Nice to meet you, Ray. Sorry, but I plan on taking up Kari's time from now on." Where did I get this from? He looked me up and down and grinned. "All you're going to do is become the next guy to have her." Then, without shaking my hand, he turned and left. He was angry. So glad. I sat back down and said as sarcastically as I could, "Nice guy." If Ray was angry, then Kari was simply beside herself with rage. She said, "He's a complete jerk." I don't know what I was thinking. Like I said, I've kissed a lot of frogs looking for a prince. This one was more of a horny toad. Then her face softened. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said with genuine emotion reflected in her incredible emerald eyes, "And I think I've finally found him. Can I skip the dance and just come to my place?" Which caused me a serious dilemma. I don't look bad, and I'm tall and well-built if you like aerodynamic figures. It's hard to believe that I was a 22-year-old virgin, isn't it? But like I said, I was either studying or swimming, and I wasn't the most confident guy in the world, especially when it came to women, so I never lost my amateur status. I'm sure Kari would expect the same performance as the dozen or more guys who took advantage of her gorgeous body. And I didn't even know how to get on stage, let alone play. We went back to her house, and she brought me a beer. We sat on the couch in her living room and continued talking. She continued to look at me expectantly. I finally decided it was time to show my cards. She was unprecedentedly frank with me, and I had to give her the same respect by admitting my complete lack of experience with equally brutal honesty. I said, "I know what you're thinking, and I have a secret to tell you." She looked at me with horror. It was as if she thought I was going to admit that I actually like men. I moved closer to her on the couch and took her small hand in both of mine. I hesitated. I didn't want my time with her to end. Meanwhile, she moved away with worry on her face. I could tell she thought I was going to tell her something like I liked seeing her tied up in a rubber suit or something like that. I said, "I hate to admit it, but I'm still a virgin." From her reaction, I realized that this was the last thing she expected to hear. I could probably announce that I'm from the planet Chaot and get a less surprised reaction. How could a modern college student live to be 22 and never have sex? I was terribly ashamed. Then she started laughing. First, laughter appeared in her eyes. Then he took over her entire face. And finally, her body began to shake with uncontrollable laughter. Okay, that was extremely offensive. I didn't come here to be laughed at. I started to get up indignantly, but she grabbed my hand and pulled me back. I was unsteady, so I fell face first onto her large sofa. When I fell, she arranged herself so that I would fall on top of her. I immediately stood up on my hands so as not to put my weight on her. Meanwhile, she frantically rummaged around my zipper. Then it happened. I'm no longer a virgin. I hurriedly entered her bathroom and brought her a cold, wet rag. She was still just lying there, and I began to gently wash her forehead. She slowly came to her senses as if she was somewhere far, far away. Her incredible emerald eyes focused, and she gasped. She said with surprise in her voice, "What did you do to me? I have never experienced anything like this in my life." I shrugged and said, "I don't know. I've never had sex before." She smiled faintly and said, "Well, whatever you do, I want you to do it to me over and over again. Now lie down next to me and hold me." I obediently turned over on my side, and she pressed her big, round, firm buttocks against my body, wrapped my arms around her, and instantly fell asleep. I lay there for a while, smelling her enticing scents and feeling her little twitches in my sleep, and I was scared shitless. There will be no other woman for me. But I only knew her for a day and had no idea what to do next. The next day, they answered this question. I woke up to a bright, sunny autumn morning. Her apartment was on the first floor of one of those old mansions in the city, so the windows were huge, like in 19th century houses, not as tiny as in modern houses, and the sun just flooded the room. She lay in my arms in the same position in which I held her when we fell asleep. Then we had sex again. I looked into her perfect face, and she looked at me with concern. I said, "You are the girl of my dreams, far more wonderful than I deserve. I'll understand if it's just one night, because I'll cherish what we shared for the rest of my life." She looked at me like I was an idiot and said cheerfully, "What makes you think you could ever leave me? You have no choice in the matter. I have finally found my prince. You are mine, and I will never let you go. We will be together forever." I know it was naive and impulsive, but we were children, and we absolutely believed that we would die in each other's arms. I never spent another night in the hostel. She had a lovely, spacious apartment, and I just packed up my things and moved in that same day. We got married at the end of the semester and spent the next 3.5 years living a happy marriage. I would see Brad on campus from time to time, and he would look at me like I was a mystery. Brad didn't understand much, so this wasn't uncommon. I didn't care at all that he and a dozen others had my wife. I knew that I was the last man who would touch her. How did I know this? She spent our entire time together trying to find more and more interesting and creative ways to show me how much she was mine. For example, after the wedding, I sometimes had to go to night competitions. By all rights, Kari should have stayed home and had fun with her friends. But she wanted to show me that she was devoted only to me. So she spent her parents' money on trips to watch me and stay in the same hotels. Trainers patrolled the hallways. Consequently, the nights spent away were chaste, but it was a sign of attention. We graduated from university together and celebrated her acceptance into law school with 2 weeks in Jamaica. Since she was still studying, I decided to continue my education too. So I entered graduate school. We went to classes all day, studied all evening, and made love all night. She was my princess, and I was her prince. That is why her death 2 days after her release was such a tragedy. You never think about the horrors that any day can bring. You kiss your beloved wife when she goes for her morning jog, and the next time you see her is in the morgue. All this beauty, all this energy, all this potential, and all this love for life lies broken on an unfeeling table. This is the reality. No guarantees. One chance in a million maybe, but that's life. We collide with each other like so many random billiard balls. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose big. He was a drunk package driver who claimed he didn't see her. His blood alcohol level was 0.19. He served 3.5 years for manslaughter, and I received $1.6 million in compensation from his company. This is how my happy life ended. We buried her in a beautiful little place on a hill in Southern California. It was near her parents' house. I flew there with her and went through the whole ceremony, full of tears. Danny Jones was now nothing more than a ghost. I might as well be buried with her. Her parents were sympathetic, no, loving. They knew what we meant to each other, but they had their own special grief. Kari was their only child, their hope, dreams, and immortality. They had the same exhausted, desperate, anguished expression that I did. I kept moving forward because life is merciless. You either march or you die. I was afraid to die, so I marched, although very reluctantly. However, all the fabulous confidences were left behind. I honestly believed that my life would work out. Thanks to fantastic luck, I met and married my soulmate. Our children would be beautiful and our lives would be fulfilled. But the gods laugh at human arrogance. Instead, I went through all 9 circles of Dante's hell. Looking back 50 years, I now understand that you go through a series of completely separate rooms in life. The room you are in is your current reality, and it seems like you've always been there, even if the room you were in before was completely different. It's not a matter of forgetting your past. Rather, it is a case of the demands of human existence constantly overriding your situational memory. It was the same with me. I closed the door of heaven. Never enter it again in life. Since I had no reason to live, I threw myself into work. Swimming took up a lot of my time when I was a student. As a result, I did well in school, but not brilliantly. Now that I had all the time in the world and no one to share it with, I discovered that I was exceptional. Kari was never far from my thoughts. That's why I dedicated everything I did in my life to her. So after I got my PhD, I did what all good little PhDs do. I started looking for a job at the department. I didn't have to work. With insurance and compensation, I could live comfortably on the interest. I was just painfully lonely. I had to do something to keep my sanity. Given the quality of my degree and my research, I had a choice of places, but I thought I could do the most good inside the belt. So I eventually took a position at a university in Fairfax, Virginia. Every good school requires a traditional march for tenure. I've been through it, and by the time I got it, I was 35 years old. I knew I would be doing the same thing year after year for 40 or 50 years. Contemplating the emptiness ahead was like looking at a journey through the go-by desert without water. They say you truly die when the last person alive forgets you. This is why people like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar have immortal in front of their names. My only goal was to keep Kari's memory alive. She never left my thoughts, although my real life passed in the fog of everyday life. No matter where I was or what I did, she was still alive in the world I lived in. Sometimes I even talked to her as if she were standing next to me. I'm sure that the tall, unmarried professor with the strange habit of muttering under his breath caused occasional rumors about my sanity, but I didn't care. She was always with me, and I felt what I felt. Then one day, after 24 long years, I felt different. At 49 years old, I went from a young, muscular, slender man to a middle-aged, still very fit, slender man. I grew my hair out as soon as I finished competing, and they were rather unkempt and disheveled. It was ironic that I was completely bald in my youth, but in my middle years I had a full head of dirty blonde hair. I was still swimming in the university pool, but that wasn't what I did as a child. I was just trying to keep in shape. One day, I was taking a relaxed backstroke to cool down after a workout when a woman appeared on the pool deck. Apparently, she was going to swim down the path next to me. I only saw her briefly as she put on her goggles and took a dive, but she was amazing. Kari was a small woman, 5'2" tall. This woman was closer to 5'10". Kari had the silky white skin of a redhead. This woman was dark-skinned and looked Italian. But the main difference was the size of her breasts. Kari had normal size, beautifully formed breasts. This woman's breasts could stop the movement. She was slim, the word fit comes to mind, but her breasts were huge. I just assumed she had multiple surgeries to get mountains like the two underneath her tier swimsuit. No sagging. She slid past me in a beautiful, relaxed style. I was more impressed by her swimming than by her breasts. This should give you an idea of what a good swimmer she was. I finished my workout, so I got out of the pool. But I had to stop for a minute and look at her. She was as sleek as a seal, with long legs and waist, and her powerful style indicated that she was likely another former student athlete with all the physical advantages that implied. I hope to see her again. It was an amazing reaction. I had no interest in women for 10 years after Kari was taken from me. Once you've experienced a woman like Kari, the rest pale in comparison. It would be like going from steak to oatmeal. Over the next 10 years, I tried to return to a normal life. It was a complete waste of time. I had one chance at the gold ring, and fate decided to snatch it from my hand. There's just no return. However, this new woman piqued my interest. Her freestyle swimming style attracted me more than her incredible body, but I felt some kind of movement in my soul on this common ground. However, even though I trained at the same time, I never saw her again. I finally ran into her a few weeks later in the most unexpected place. I was at one of those endless faculty parties. I was there by order, personally summoned by the dean. Otherwise, I would be in any other place. I stood against the familiar wall, holding the ubiquitous glass of sherry. Sherry is always served at these events. Apparently, they think this way you won't get too drunk at 2 ounces per drink. I stared blankly at the room, wanting to be anywhere but here, when the dean appeared in front of me. He looked like a hamster and was about as smart. But he's a real genius at department politics and political sucking up. Therefore, it had to be taken seriously. There was a woman with him. He said, "Danny, I want you to meet Janet Luca. She just got hired in your department, and since you're an old-timer, I want you to show her around, maybe give her a little guidance." I looked over and saw the mysterious woman from the pool. The gods spend a lot of time laughing at me. She was taller than a hamster, with thick dark brown hair cut into a preppy bob. She also wore a full preppy outfit, a cashmere cardigan over the obligatory white Oxford shirt, a gray pencil skirt, and 3-inch heels. She looked like she had just stepped out of the pages of a J. Crew catalog. And she was amazing. She clearly tried to hide her body as much as possible, but it was impossible. Her breasts were too big. The impressive black string of pearls around her long neck pointed in my direction and not towards her feet as it should have. I said, "Of course, boss." And the hamster left, having fulfilled his duty. I turned to her and extended my hand, trying to speak in a neutral tone, and said, "Danny Jones at your service." She looked cheerful and said, "I saw you at the pool, so there's no need to pretend you don't know me." I chuckled and said, "That was impressive style. Did you swim in college?" She replied, "I swam at Berkeley for 4 years." Well, kindred spirit," I said, "I was doing the same thing in Ann Arbor, but that was probably 10 to 15 years before you." She said, I was a student 12 years ago. So this was about 15 years ago. We then began an hour-long exchange of stories about our sporting achievements, which led to an evening at the Willow restaurant in Fairfax. By the end of the evening, I knew that she had an exceptional sense of humor and that she was an expert in the field of political science. She also had a degree from the Ridge School, which is located in Erie, Pennsylvania. It's a leading school in the field, but seriously, Erie. I also knew she was great. When I took my eyes off her protruding breasts, I saw a perfect oval face and very dark, almost black eyes. Those eyes had the same intelligent sparkle as my Kari's. Her lips were sensually seductive. She was like the hottest preppy of all time. For the first time in 24 years, I felt attracted. She was a recruit and had only been in town for 3 weeks. She was still living in a long-term hotel while she was looking for a place to live. This search was complicated by the fact that she had no idea where the area was. The next day was Saturday, and I arranged to meet her for breakfast at the IHOP near the Ballston subway stop. I chose this location because it was easy for her to get to from Clarendon. But coincidentally, it is also a common secret meeting place for big shots from various alphabet agencies in the area. She was dressed preppy casual today, typical chinos, and one of those cardigans with a blue, red, and yellow diamond patterned cape over a light blue turtleneck, with boat shoes on her feet, light gold chain around the neck. She was spectacular in her portrayal of Xena, the war princess visiting Wellesley. She did a full makeover, and I was forced to up my rating of her face from beautiful to otherworldly. It was mainly because of her eyes. Those eyes were huge, dark, and hypnotically seductive. I managed to find a spot in their parking lot. So after some coffee and chat, we set off to find her a place to live. I told her that the smartest thing to do would be to find an apartment near a metro stop. So we rode the Orange Line most of the day. And she finally settled on a neat little place in West Falls. When we were done looking for an apartment, I took her back to her hotel in the Clarendon area. She seemed hesitant and thoughtful as we drove back, so I asked her what the problem was. She said, "Now that you have done your duty, will I see you again?" I said, "This is a real pleasure, not a duty, and we will see each other often on campus. My office is not far from yours in the same building." She said, "That's not what I meant. Will we see each other socially?" I said, "I haven't had a date since my wife died. You were probably in high school then." She looked shocked and said with horror in her voice, "Your wife died? How did this happen?" I tried to keep the pain in my voice as I said, "She was hit by a drunk driver while she was jogging. We were only married for 3 years. Her untimely death tore out my heart and trampled on it. I have not looked at a woman since that day 24 years ago." Then I hesitated a little and carefully added, "Until now." She looked stunned and said, "What do you mean by that?" Okay, I totally screwed it up. I quickly retracted that statement so she wouldn't think I was some kind of psycho stalker. I said, I find you attractive, and for the first time in years, I have a desire to get to know a woman better. I don't know what it is, maybe in general, but I want to explore our relationship further if you do not mind." She did what only women do when they seem to melt. She took one of my hands in her two and said with sincerity, "I would really like that." Interest charges did their job, and the money paid for Kari's death turned into a large amount of cash over 24 years. I would never spend the compensation. It was Kari's money, but the percentages were a gray area and they were significant. So I bought myself a boat. It was purely a survival mechanism. Being on the water was the only way to combat the overwhelming feelings of boredom and cosmic resentment that constantly washed over me. I thought Kari would approve. I had to survive to preserve her memory. Janet and I still had a lot to discuss before making any decisions. A day on the boat seemed like a neutral way to start it off, so I invited her to go swimming the following weekend. I ran into her several times over the next week. She was completely professional in her interactions with me. She was a smart girl. She had been in academia long enough to know that faculty members had about the same level of maturity as high school students, especially when it comes to talking about matters of the heart. I was a senior teacher, and she was a novice and designated mentee. We both could foresee a lot of gossip that could ruin a career in such a situation. She was still in the process of moving into her apartment, so I picked her up from her place in Clarendon. She was dressed for the boat ride in modest white shorts, boat shoes, and a navy blue polo shirt with a small alligator on it. This was the first time since our first meeting in the pool that her body was truly visible. It was great. You can't compete at the college level without having nice, muscular legs. But the round butt and shapely thighs in these shorts were also a work of art. Given the challenge her large breasts posed for casual wear, the Izod polo was perhaps the most elegant compromise. She wore her shirt untucked, so it kind of hung off her front, which left the impression that she was hiding watermelons underneath. But at the same time, she looked athletic and completely sexy, or at least how sexy a woman with such a figure could look. I kept the boat at James Creek Marina behind Fort McNair. The 7-mile trip took the usual 45 minutes in Washington, D.C. traffic. All the way to the marina, we talked about her first week. She was remarkably insightful in her assessments of her colleagues, and it was clear that she had a first-class mind, especially in her ability to maneuver through the morass of departmental politics. We arrived at the boat, and she just stood there with her mouth open. I don't know what kind of boat she expected to see when I invited her, but obviously not the one that was in front of her. Maybe she thought I was talking about a dinghy. Admittedly, the C&C 40 is an impressive yacht. This is a jib with a 15-meter mast located slightly forward of the center. From where we were, it seemed like the mast was going into the sky. Compared to real racing dinghies, the boat itself is sturdy, almost a little overweight. Her wide hull makes her an excellent cruiser. Janet stepped aboard, continuing to look around as if she had never been on a boat. She asked, "Is this yours?" I replied, "She's over 30 years old, but she's still a very well-preserved old lady." We placed our equipment and food. Then I untied us and took us out to Anacostia and soon to the Potomac. We were motoring at this stage because there was too much traffic on the river to reliably sail, at least until we passed Halloween Point and entered the wider area. She sat next to me, enjoying the sun and bustle. I showed her the sights, passing Alexandria, National Harbor, and Mount Vernon. I didn't want to go far, but I wanted to raise the sail so she could experience that feeling. I set the autopilot as we rounded the point and asked her to hold the halyard while I removed the cover from the mainsail. She pulled on the halyard as if she were trying to hoist a sail by hand, and it seemed that she would have the strength to do it. I walked up behind her to wrap the halyard around the top slot of the winch, and she leaned on me. It was an amazing feeling that I hadn't experienced in 2 decades. The power winch raised the sail. She clapped her hands with joy. Then, as I was securing the halyard to the cleat, the wind changed, the sail flapped and filled, and we lay down on a nice port tack. I hurried back to take the helm and told her to wrap the halyard around the cleat. When she bent over to do this, I saw a perfect apple-shaped ass. She came back to me with sparkling eyes. She said, "It was the most exciting thing I've ever done." I said, "Yes, that's what happens on a big boat." We went back and forth for a while to get her to feel it. When I was sure we were clear of shipping traffic, I gave her the helm. I told her to just steer by feeling the ship, the wind, and the helmsman are one organism. She looked absolutely delighted. Finally, I brought us to the place where I wanted to anchor, which was Belmont Bay on the Virginia side. It is surrounded by Mason Neck State Park. Although there is a marina on the southeast side and plenty of powerboats and jet skis, the bay is large enough that our anchorage on the far side is both secluded and semi-secret. I dropped anchor bow and stern, and she looked at me expectantly. Why do women always do this? She seemed to expect me to make a romantic move, which was still far from reality. I felt more for this woman than any other in 2 decades, but Kari was the only one I was close to. and this closeness was still very precious to me. I said, "Let's sit down and talk. I told you about my life, at least what has happened since my wife died. Tell me about yourself. Have you been married before?" Her face darkened. She almost looked scared. I said softly, "You don't have to tell me about yourself if you don't want to. I was just hoping to get to know you better. I'm interested, that's all." She looked like she was having a fight in her head. Finally, she said, "I started developing very early, and these were the results." She gestured contemptuously at her chest. She continued, "At first I was thrilled because all the boys I knew wanted me, even the older ones. Then I realized that was all they ever wanted. None of them appreciated that I was smarter than most and also better athletically. All they wanted was to get to these guys." And this time she actually wrapped her arms around them. She added, "I kept them all at a distance until my first year at UCLA. There I met a prince on a white horse. James was everything I ever wanted in a man, elegant, handsome. He seemed to care about me, and he inherited gold, silver, and uranium mines from his father. So he was also fabulously rich and influential. I was only 19 then. He was 8 years older than me. We met at a club in San Francisco, and James thought I was his age because of my appearance. We lived together all through college, and in my 4th year, he proposed to me. Getting married was something that all the girls in my social circle were doing, and it felt right. I wish I had spent a little time thinking about it rather than just jumping into it. But I was still just a girl, and James was very convincing. The problem was that from the moment we got married, I became one of his possessions, and he turned into a control freak. He hid this little obsession well from me during the courtship, but once we got married, he started making his own rules, sometimes in quite physical ways. So I became the princess in the tower. Living with him was my worst nightmare. He didn't want me to do anything other than be at his disposal. My life was dictated to me. I was not allowed to have meaningful conversations with men, and God help me if I flirted or danced with someone. In fact, he was also jealous of my girlfriends, so I had to get rid of them too. He had a lot of money, so I dedicated myself to spending it for him. It was my way of getting revenge for the way he treated me. I bought everything I could imagine, from expensive clothes to cars. And the more I spent, the deader I became inside. He didn't care how much I spent as long as I didn't express my opinion or do something of my own free will, and he expected me to fulfill any sexual whim he demanded. The word girl for money comes to mind. The sex was often disgusting and humiliating, but I had no choice. He completely owned me. It was a living hell. I was allowed to continue swimming because it kept me in shape to support his ego. But that was only in our pool at our home in the Santa Monica Mountains. I couldn't divorce him. He had me by the throat, sometimes literally, and his bodyguards were constantly watching me. I was essentially under house arrest for the entire 7 years of our marriage. Then, fortunately or unfortunately, as it turns out, he found a new woman. She was as well endowed as I was, and she was only 20 years old, and he even seemed to like her for the strange things he did to her. The problem was that we had reinforced concrete fidelity. Adultery was the main point, so he planned to trade the old bitch for a new one by setting me up. One of the guys who was watching me started helping me escape sometimes. It was just walks on the beach and coffee at Bobby's, but it was freedom. He seemed kind and compassionate. I really started to trust him. I actually started to fall in love with him. I know how naive it sounds, but I was protected all my life, and I was afraid that my husband would kill me. It was Stockholm Syndrome. One night, my friend was the only one watching me. He came to our home theater with drinks and popcorn and suggested we watch Steel Magnolias. That in itself should have alerted me. No guy is capable of sitting through this movie, no matter how dedicated he is. Well, it turns out he didn't have to sit for long. We were at the beauty salon when my vision became blurry. The next thing I remember is this morning. I was lying naked in my bed with my so-called friend lying next to me. But thanks to my jailer lover, I couldn't even go to the hospital to get my blood tested. Of course, James received all the video evidence he needed to end the prenuptial agreement. I left our home with the clothes on my back and a sizable lump sum payment, enough to start a new life in Portland, where I eventually moved. I had a good education, so I found a job in marketing at a company in Gresham. But I planned to never trust a man in my life again. I worked there for a year and tried to restore my wounded mind and self-confidence. I didn't date or even look at men. They were the cause of my problems in the first place. I did make a few friends. One of them had just gotten out of the army. She was stationed up north at Fort Lewis McChord doing reconnaissance, and after a year of talking to her about the field, we both decided to qualify. So Margaret and I packed all our things and drove 2,500 miles to Erie. It was the best 3 years of my life. We lived together in an old house in the city center. I lived the life of a graduate student, and at the age of 33, I finally found my purpose in life. I even started dating again, but it was completely different from when I was a student. And all the men I dated were younger than me. I was never serious with any of them. Men were the cause of my problems. But Margaret finally met the man who was perfect for her. He was also a veteran and an honest, hard-working guy. She married him after we all graduated and we went our separate ways. I found my way here and met you, and that's the end of my story. She sat back down, looking at me as if I was going to take her home after finding out all her dark secrets. It was very touching. I said, "So life has cheated us both. I lost my wife for no apparent reason, and you were used and betrayed by your ex-husband. It seems like we are perfect for each other." She made that same look again. It was somewhere between melting and sexuality burning inside. I never understood what goes on in the jungle of a woman's mind. She came up to me, wrapped her arms around me, and, tilting her head back, looked into my eyes. Many emotions played in her gaze. I was uncomfortably aware of the feeling of her large breasts moving between us. She said with some irony in her voice, "From the moment we met, I felt that you were the first man I could trust. Is this true, or am I wrong?" I said, "You can trust me as a friend. You can trust me as an advisor. You'll probably never be able to trust me as a sexual partner because I haven't been with a woman since my wife died. In fact, you're the first woman I've held in my arms in 2 decades. She looked stunned and said, "How is this possible? How could you do this?" I said, "It's easy when you're broken. We're both broken. Maybe we can help each other put Humpty Dumpty back together." This was not the beginning of a wild sex frenzy on a boat, but nevertheless, something did happen that night. I went down to the galley and prepared what we had brought, and we ate and talked for several hours in the cockpit. We observed wildlife, ducks, geese, and the occasional heron. I drank a little wine, and she drank a lot. I ended up getting one of the sleeping bags I kept in the sail compartment, and we lay down on the foredeck, watching the sunset, and then just holding hands, looking up at the stars. She pressed herself against me, her large breasts lying on my chest, and her head on my shoulder. Sometimes she would get up and look at me carefully while we were talking. One of these times I looked into her face and saw the depth of emotion in her endlessly dark eyes. Her lips were close to mine, and what happened next was natural, even after 2 decades without anyone. Her lips touched mine and we kissed. We were both fully dressed, but I think it was a more passionate fight than if we had actually made love. She made pitiful little efforts as she squirmed beneath me. The strength of her female body was indescribable. I was also pleased to note that no silicone was used in the creation of her huge breasts. It was all Janet. I looked into her deep, intelligent face and said, "Maybe we were meant to heal each other." There was no subsequent night of endless passion on the boat. I still had a very significant ghost to deal with, and Janet had her own demons. All these things prevented us from immediately moving towards sexual connection or even love. But what we did was break the barrier of intimacy. A woman's body became special to me for the first time in 2 decades. It almost seemed as if Kari's spirit had graciously retreated from my mind so that I could be happy with another woman. And I think Janet was really surprised by how easily and comfortably we became a couple. We worked together as colleagues when we were on campus, but the evenings were different. 12 years ago, I bought a condominium in Georgetown. I acquired it after I was promoted to full professor. It was much bigger and better than her apartment, and eventually Janet began to live there. The transition between dating and moving in was moving and illustrated how deeply wounded she was. In my case, I lived alone for so long that I had to learn to live with someone again. In her case, it was the belief that I would not be her husband. She was like a wild animal. Most of the time, we were calm and loving each other, but the slightest difficulty made her run back to her apartment. However, we eventually got used to each other. That's the only way I can explain it. It was simply a matter of becoming completely comfortable with the wanderer. We lived everyday lives, and our union was built on humble, everyday things. I've seen her in every possible situation, from morning hair to killer outfits. We shared newspapers at breakfast and in the evenings in front of the TV. We went everywhere and did everything as a couple. And inevitably, the daily routine brought us closer until we finally became lovers. It wasn't an instant passion like with Kari. It took several months for us to take the final steps to strengthen the alliance. It all started with her sleepovers. It was quite logical. We were completely confident in each other's motives at that moment, and so her sleeping with me was not a problem. But making love was too far away for either of us to contemplate. We loved each other so much that neither of us wanted to cross that irreversible line between friendship and the problems that sexual intimacy might pose. I still wasn't ready to leave Kari behind, even though my wife had been dead for 25 years. Janet acted like a victim. If anything, she was clearly traumatized by the way her husband used her body. She slept with me in a pair of panties and a long UCLA football jersey, no bra. We often woke up hugging each other. To be honest, this thought crossed my mind. You'd have to be an Easter Island statue not to get horny waking up with her muscular leg resting on top of yours and her huge, soft breasts pressed against your chest. But I never acted because I still considered Kari my wife. I remembered a similar situation 25 years ago, and everything down there became soft. And Janet clearly had the same ambivalences. It was as if the moment we became intimate, she knew that I would turn into the monster that her husband was. This problem was solved because alcohol is faster. One evening, we were downtown on M Street, and we both drank a lot. So we cheerfully returned to the condo, which was next to the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath. I usually sleep in a t-shirt and boxers, but the room swayed slightly, so I just took off all my clothes and dove under the covers. Janet looked at me, and she did the same, laughing all the way. It was like a copycat game. I've seen her naked before, but it was like that for many married couples, part of the daily routine. I never really looked at it because I knew where it would lead, and I wasn't ready to go there yet. But in the state I was in, it was inevitable that I would appreciate her body, and I was drunk enough to not care what that meant. She was incredible. Swimmers tend to be slim, like me. Janet was the embodiment of strength, not aerodynamics. She was completely curvy, with broad shoulders and a thin waist that flowed into muscular thighs and world-class legs. I knew she was strong. We had enough heated, not quite finishing sessions for it to stick in my mind. But really looking at her naked body now, all I could think about was making love to her. She climbed into bed next to me, still laughing. I rose up on one elbow and looked into her eyes. She looked back at me. She was completely in love. I pressed my lips to hers, and she opened up to me like a flower. It was obvious that Janet had learned a lot from her ex-husband, and she was very aggressive. We lay there for a few minutes, not saying anything, when she spoke in a trembling voice. She asked, "Will you change now?" "Damn it, I knew it," I said with confidence. "Yes, honey." I heard a sigh of despair. I said, "I'm going to change into the most loving, caring, and devoted husband you've ever had." There was a long silence as she took in this new information. She then screamed in absolute delight, "Husband, so you want to marry me?" I've been thinking about this for a while. This experience provided the missing element. I said, as soon as possible, my love, I'm ready to put on a ring so everyone knows that you're mine. She threw herself at me, crying. She said, oh God, I've never wanted anything more in my life. So we got married. This was a surprise to all our colleagues as we were conducting our relationship under the radar. But they could see how much we loved each other, and several of them seemed kind of happy for us. The rest didn't care. What can I say? Academicians are a little more narcissistic than cats. We settled into the routine of faculty life. We gave our lectures, conducted research, and wrote articles. When we weren't doing that, we enjoyed each other's company. Long sessions of lovemaking often followed. A dozen years flew by in a whirlwind of joy, peace, and love. As I approached my 62nd year, I could still answer the phone. And Janet was just as beautiful and sensual at 47 as she was at 35. She still swam as often as she could, and her beautiful face and incredible body haven't changed one bit. But the inner woman has expanded to fill every corner of her potential. Part of the problem with marrying someone much younger than you is that they are always in a different room in their life. We never had conflicts about personal goals, and we were perfect for each other. But Janet was no longer the woman I married 12 years ago, and I was definitely not the man I was then. Her intelligence and strength of character led her to leadership positions in both academia and politics. While I reached a point in my career where I began the process of taking stock, I wasn't ready to go out to pasture yet. But over a lifetime, a lot of capital accumulates, and eventually you want to start breaking it down to put everything into perspective. So while Janet continued to expand her empire, I was happy to sit back and decide which of the stuffed moose and other pieces of junk in the attic of my mind were worth keeping. By then I was an elder, so I still had a lot of invitations to speak and requests for articles. But I was summing up and summarizing rather than exploring new territory. I was happy with my situation. Your immortality is in your words, not in your deeds. And I wanted to leave a legacy of ideas that people would read and think about long after I left this earth. The fact of human frailty was imprinted on my psyche very early thanks to Kari. I was pretty sure Janet's career was her priority. But in our family life, she has always been very loving and deeply respectful of me. And the sex was still exceptional. I still remembered the spirited debates and battles of my 40s when the thrill of new worlds to conquer was in the air. An important aspect of marriage is helping your partner be happy. In that regard, I think I have become a safe haven for Janet. Our marriage gave her a protected space in which she could retreat and recharge. It was comforting and safe for her. But Janet was clearly happiest when she was conquering new worlds. The problem with empire building is that it forces you to look outward instead of inward, and you may lose sight of the important things in life. Confused priorities will color your actions. I never doubted that our marriage was important to Janet, but people can have illusions of grandeur when they have been winning for a long time. And Janet simply lost sight of her own mortality. She began to think that she was invincible. Believe it or not, the first sign of trouble in paradise was provided by one of the students. Students will do anything to make a personal connection with you. It's not that they're trying to make you like them. They just think they'll get a break if you know who they are. Richard Bowen was the nerd of nerds, and I already knew him. But he was also a world-class sycophant, so there wasn't a single part of my life that he wasn't trying to connect with. He worked part-time as a waiter at restaurant 1789, which is located near the Georgetown campus. One day, he was sitting in my laboratory, more or less interrupting what I was doing. He said, purely for conversation's sake, I saw Professor Jones last night. I said, that's good. He added, she had dinner with Professor Willis. He got my attention, but I didn't react. Janet was supposed to be in Baltimore for a counterterrorism session. She arrived so late that I was already asleep. I asked, are you sure it was her? He replied, oh yes, I would recognize Professor Jones anywhere. She is so beautiful, and everyone noticed her in the dress she wore. By this, I meant that the little caresser was referring to Janet's obvious assets in something low-cut. This puzzled me. She left for class in the middle of the day in her usual pre-university clothes. She did not tell me that she was going to deviate from her original plan, which was to attend the seminar at Hopkins. And why shouldn't she change into a sexy evening dress? More importantly, where would she do it? Additionally, the man she was allegedly with was a junior staff member we hired at the beginning of the previous school year. Norbert Willis was a 40-year-old geospatial intelligence expert, fresh out of Duke and the university's local phallic symbol. He was perhaps 6 years younger than Janet. His classes were packed, not so much because of the knowledge he imparted, but because of the way he did it. He was very handsome in a friendly, East Coast, prep school, 6th grade, angelic, choir boy. Obviously, he was from a wealthy family. Not many newly hired junior professors have a place in the Palisades and drive a Mercedes SOK, and he definitely had an eye for women. As a senior member of the department, I had to give him a mandatory lecture on sexual harassment after one of the students complained. And he definitely treated me like his father during the conversation, which I very well could have been. Everyone knew that he was a thoroughbred libertine, and I may have been 60 years old, but my brain had not yet fully calcified. Janet stood out among all the women on this campus, both in terms of beauty and sexuality, so I assumed he spent a lot of his free time barking at her tree. Normally, I would have ignored Bowen's little fib because it didn't make any sense. But if what he said was true, then it was something I needed to investigate. Because Janet clearly didn't bother to tell me about her change of plans. But we didn't have such a relationship. She was sitting at the kitchen table grading student papers when I got home. She wore an oversized baggy Georgetown sweater and yoga pants, and her brown hair was pulled back into a messy bun. She chewed on a pencil eraser, something she did when she was concentrating. It was an absolutely charming sight. There might have been a good explanation for why she wasn't where she said she should be. So I wanted to give her the opportunity to not barge in and scream, "What the hell, Janet?" However, I had to know the story. She raised her mouth for the usual passionate greeting. I poured a cup of rosehip tea and sat down opposite her. When we do this, we always have a light conversation. It's a nice way to reconnect after a long day in the salt mines of the academy. She sat across from me without makeup or other tricks that women use to appear more attractive, and she was still a stunningly beautiful woman. "Well, for a penny, for a pound," I said as casually as I could. "How was the seminar in Baltimore? I can't think of anything I wouldn't want to do more than go there to hear someone talk about craft." She looked up and with an honest expression on her face replied, "Oh, that was very interesting. I even stayed after to talk to Dr. Ostrovsky. When I returned, it was 2 a.m. You were already asleep." Okay, that's it. Either she just looked me in the eyes and lied, or Bowen was delusional. I didn't react. To be honest, my first thought wasn't infidelity. It was more of a bewilderment. Our relationship has always been honest and frank, and there was probably a logical explanation. Janet never gave me the slightest hint that she was dissatisfied with our life together. But why would she lie about something as harmless as dinner with a coworker, even if he is a famous ladies' man? I'm not one of those people who sneaks around and spies on my spouse. I had a range of electronic options given my profession. But bugging your wife is the highest degree of disrespect. So if there was a problem, I wanted to know about it. I just looked at her and said as casually as I could, "Do you remember Richard Bowen? You might remember me mentioning him. He's the brown nose, a pain in the ass in my pen testing class." She laughed and said, "Of course I remember. You complain about him every other day." I continued, "He said he saw you last night, all dressed up, at restaurant 1789. He's a waiter there." Her face didn't change one bit as she laughed cheerfully again and said, "He must have been mistaken. I had a snack before the lecture at Sterling's. They have great crabs. We should eat there sometime." Okay, Bowen was sucking up again. It was typical of his behavior to make something up just to try to become one of my buddies, or perhaps Bowen simply had the wrong day. But I also knew that Janet had a very strong and flexible mind. Even by surprise, she could get out. Several months have passed. Our relationship was as great as ever. We talked and laughed and made spontaneous love. Then I ran into Hamster in the corridor. We've made common colleague-to-colleague politeness necessary when you can't avoid someone. He asked me if I was going to the IACA conference. This year it took place in Chicago. I told him Janet was going, but I have too much to do here. I was due for a chapter I was writing for an anthology on cybercrime profiling. He looked pleased. Deans are always happy to hear about faculty publications. This reflects well on their leadership. He said, "In this case, Janet and Norb will represent us well." If it weren't for Bowen, this little fact would have passed me by. I suddenly became very interested in their travel plans. I nodded and said conversationally, "Are they the only ones going?" He said, "They are the only ones who have applied for funding for the trip. Perhaps someone else will go at their own expense, but I doubt it." I said something funny about the teachers and walked down the hallway thinking, why didn't she tell me that? Over dinner at Philemus that night, I asked her about the trip. She looked up, her dark eyes glowing in the candlelight. She was great. She said, "I received a request to chair the session. Dave Whipple had to go, so I agreed to fill in for him." I asked, "Who else is coming?" She replied, "No one from here." This was said without hesitation and without any emotion. It was a simple statement. This was another lie. Unless she knew Willis was coming. This is not a strange situation, since teachers are rarely in one place at the same time. Perhaps she really didn't know. But it was strange enough that I decided to take action. I am perhaps too straightforward in my life. But my only response to what I don't understand is to confront it and figure it out. This was a situation that needed to be resolved and not left to chance. I said, "Professor Willis is coming too. Did you know about this?" She hesitated for a moment and said, "No, I didn't know that. Perhaps we can meet when we are there. Do you know if he is staying at the conference hotel?" Okay, she was a great liar. I said, "I think you knew about this, and it makes me wonder what else you haven't told me. I hope there is nothing between you two. You are a beautiful woman, and I don't blame men for pursuing you. I know Willis is the star of the campus now, but he is also known as a student harasser and a thoroughbred ladies' man. One day, he will be caught by someone who cares, and that will be the end of his career. So I hope and expect that you will respect our marriage and maintain a professional relationship whenever you two are together." She looked almost offended, or was it wariness? She may have been reacting to my comment about the students. She said, "You're the man I love. All I ever wanted was to be married to you. Norbert is nothing compared to you. And we mean too much to each other for me to risk anything with him. I really didn't know he was going to be there until you told me." It sounded convincing. Perhaps I answered my own question. Maybe she didn't want me to know that she would be in Chicago with this guy because I knew about his reputation, and she didn't want to face the possibility that I might misunderstand the situation. After all, there are many men and women present at the conference, and there would be no problem if she was there with any other man, for example, with Hamster. Of course, that little incident a month ago was up in the air, and there was enough reasonable doubt surrounding the entire sequence of events that I wanted to confirm once and for all that there was no problem. So I did something clever myself. I realized that I couldn't get the hard truth out of Janet unless I waterboarded her, so I decided to investigate directly. And human is always the best way when you want to get reliable information about a situation. So I booked a first-class ticket from DCA to Ord. I planned to arrive at the hotel before Janet arrived and find out who she was coming with. I would return to Washington that night, and she would never know I was there. I left the condominium at dawn on the day of the conference. I told her that I had a very early meeting at the NCTC. The flight from Washington to Chicago takes just over an hour and a half. I was on the first plane, so I was at the Thompson Hotel on Chicago's Gold Coast in time to enjoy a great breakfast at Nico Osteria. I then sat comfortably in a chair in the lobby. I could quietly watch the reception from there. I timed my arrival based on Janet's travel plans. I hoped I wouldn't have to wait too long. An hour later, I was reading the Sun-Times sports page when she walked up to the front desk with a rolling suitcase. She was the epitome of a strong, energetic woman, tall and beautiful with that gorgeous body without looking her real age. She was just dripping with sex appeal. I positioned myself so she couldn't see me when she finished registering. She turned towards the elevators with joyful anticipation. There, she was joined by a handsome man of about 40. He was also pulling a suitcase behind him. Side by side, they happily pushed their suitcases into the elevator. And when the doors were closing, I saw how she just walked up to him for a kiss. I put down the newspaper and walked decisively to the reception desk. I could just demand. I could have just asked for the key since the credit card was in my name. But I knew the hotel would give me trouble if I did that. No hotel wants confrontation. So I walked over, looking worried, and said, "Has my wife checked in yet? Oh my God, I couldn't find parking." The clerk at the counter looked skeptical and asked for ID, which I happily provided. He clicked on the terminal a few times and saw that Janet had indeed signed up and was using the same card as me. This satisfied him. He turned on the false sincerity and, burning out the key card for me, said, "Enjoy your stay." I was almost certain that this stay would be short and unforgettably unpleasant. I went up to the third floor and walked down the hall to room 317. They were only 15 minutes ahead of me on the elevator. I planned to confront them immediately. No listening at the door or other small tricks. Before crossing my personal Rubicon, I said a little prayer that nothing would be as it seemed. There must be a logical explanation. I inserted the card. The light flashed green, and I quietly opened the door. I didn't have to be secretive. It was hard to believe there was enough time to catch them in bed. But never underestimate the power of love, or perhaps passion is a better word. I saw them passionately having sex. I stood there with my phone, filming the last 30 seconds of this performance. Then I started to applaud slowly. It took a few seconds for it to register. Then they both shuddered and looked in my direction. I said with the greatest irony I could muster, "Bravo, what a brilliant performance." This caused a flurry of activity. Then, in a desperate attempt to reach his pants, he fell off the bed. He crawled on all fours to where his pants lay, only to find that I'm standing on them. I looked down at him from almost 6 feet. He seemed completely scared and said in a pleading voice, "Please." I laughed and moved away from his pants. He grabbed them, jumped up, and disappeared from the room, fastening them as he went. It was pure comedy. I turned to Janet with a question in my eyes. She clutched the sheet to her chest. She looked upset, but didn't cry. She is an intellectually strong and very strong-willed woman. She knew what she had done, and she knew she probably wouldn't come back. But her pride did not allow her to whine. She was going to meet me without hysterics and try to save the situation. "Honor and praise to her," she said with self-hatred in every tone of her voice. "I guess there's no chance you could forgive me for this. I'd spend the rest of my life trying to atone for this." I was incredibly angry. But this was a heavyweight fight. The one who breaks first will not be able to look at himself in the mirror after that. I said with complete confidence in my voice, "No way. The only question left is how we end this. I don't even care what you did it." Her face began to disintegrate, cracks appearing in her facade. She said, "You know I love you with all my heart. It was just a passing prank, a little forbidden excitement. It was insignificant compared to our love for each other, and it wouldn't last. He pursued me relentlessly, and he's so young and charming. I never thought you'd know." It was the usual nonsense of a deceiver. I said with deep sadness and regret, "But I have learned, my dear, and there is no way to forget what I saw or forgive it, not now, not ever." I even understand that it was pride that made you do it. You went too far, plain and simple. You thought you were too smart to ever get caught. But there's too much unpredictability in the cheating equation. You can't control everything. Eventually, the evidence piles up. And here we are. It was really very clear. She spent her first marriage breaking every sexual boundary possible, and the sex itself was likely extremely stimulating, even if it was promiscuous. The whole situation was just so seductively forbidden. So whatever the first step, I'm sure their romance was fueled by his forbidden nature. In fact, her self-hatred was probably part of the general excitement. I was also sure that her unhappiness with what she was doing would quickly bring her back to me, and there was every reason to believe that she would never do it again. But she made me realize that I never really loved her, or at least not the way I loved Kari. There was no devastating feeling of resentment and deep despair over her loss, no intense hatred of her or her lover, no regret for what I discovered, only melancholy. I said with despondency in my voice, "I'm going home now, and I'll ask you to move as soon as you return. You remember that the apartment is entirely in my name, right? I'm sure your lover will be more than happy to have you. What you did looked pretty hot. I'm sure he'll want more of it. Just tell me when you need to pick up your things, and I'll help you pack." At this point, she began to sob. She kept saying, "I love you, Danny. I didn't want this to happen. Please, 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 can't we work out something? Don't throw away 12 wonderful years. I'll do anything." She then burst into heart-wrenching sobs. I said with the weight of the world on my shoulders, "You threw it away, not me. I wasn't the one who spread the legs of that horny piece of shit. Honestly, I don't love you enough to forgive you for this betrayal." She said with contempt and bitterness. She said with contempt and bitterness, "You would forgive her. I know you would. I could never compete with her, ever. This was the reason I did it." I understood what she meant, and she was absolutely right. I said softly and sadly, "I know." Then I turned and left, closing the door to the penultimate room of my life. I hired a lawyer to clear up this mess. Most of what we had in assets came into the marriage, so sorting through our worldly goods was relatively quick and easy. Janet tried every way she could to convince me to take her back, but in the end, she showed how smart she was. She realized that she had crossed the line beyond which a woman never returns and signed the papers. In many ways, I punished myself more than I punished her. Nobody wants to die alone, and that's what I've condemned myself to. I had no intention of looking for another woman. Janet married the idiot almost immediately after the divorce was finalized. Instead, I got a dog. In my opinion, I was getting the more loving and faithful being of the two. I had a conversation with the dean the day after I returned. The photos on my phone led to Idiot's immediate dismissal. It was easy to use the faculty's moral clause against him because he didn't have a permanent contract. Janet had a permanent contract. That's why nothing happened to her, at least right away, but promotion to full professor will now never happen in her life. Overnight, Janet went from rising star to outcast. It destroyed her. I felt sorry. This meant that her career would end in disgrace. But I couldn't burn Dr. Norbert Willis without burning my ex-wife. I've encountered her several times. This could not be avoided. We worked in the same place. She always looked at me with the saddest face. It was a powerful cocktail of regret and anguish mixed with shame. I didn't want her to suffer, but I didn't have the answers. She created this problem herself. Willis was completely destroyed in academic circles. No place will hire a teacher with a moral dismissal on his record. He had a lot of money, all inherited. Janet had nowhere to go, so she moved in with him. I saw them from time to time in Georgetown. Neither party looked like they wanted to be with the other, but the circumstances are such that they are now stuck together. I heard through rumors among the teachers that he still cheats a lot. It might have been karma, but it pained me to know that Janet had to endure this. I still loved her in my own way. I taught for 3 more years and retired at 66. I had a good pension, and with Kari's money, I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted with the rest of my life. I bought a small motorhome and buster, and I traveled for 3 years, visiting every place I ever wanted to see in the US and Canada. But I was tired of the cold weather and didn't want to spend the rest of my life on the road. Accordingly, Buster and I launched the boat at Key West. I planned to stay there for a long time. I expected it to be another 10 years or so, since I was still hale and hearty at 71, which brings me to today. Present time, 1500 hours on Monday. It was a clear, cloudless day in Key West. I have been on the island for the last 3 years, and it has been in line with my lifestyle. All I ever wanted was the feeling of peace and contentment that I had during those years with Kari. I remembered those times like it was yesterday, even if half a century has passed. The easy life of a boat tramp was as close to an earthly paradise without her as it could be. It was a little unsettling to realize that I was only thinking about Kari and not my ex-wife. Janet was right. I've never loved anyone but Kari, and maybe I did Janet a disservice by marrying her in the first place. But you do stupid things when you lose sight of the ultimate goals of life. I knew what I wanted now, so all I did was sit in the sun with my trusty old friend and wait. I started talking to her again, which probably explained why all the tourists gave me a wide berth. However, as I entered my 70s, Kari increasingly occupied my thoughts. I was relaxing with a cheap scotch on the rocks at Captain Tony's. This was a real Hemingway drink, not those daiquiris they sell to tourists. I enjoyed the view of the street. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, there were weather problems, but the Keys have been especially quiet this summer. The sun was tropically hot, but if you know how to deal with it, you can enjoy the lush surroundings. And if you're at the daily sunset celebration in Mallory Square, you understand how much fun the people of the Conch Republic get from their beautiful island. The verdant greenery and ocean are soothing to the eye. And if you're in the shade with a cool drink, it's like you don't have a care in the world. It was one of the few times since my divorce that I felt content. Unfortunately, this situation was about to change. Dramatically, at that very moment, a huge tropical depression struck from the Sahara. In the global mix of weather patterns, such disturbances almost always herald severe Atlantic storms. This front had the lowest barometric readings ever observed by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration meteorologists on the GOES system. The front passed Dakar and entered the South Atlantic, absorbing enormous amounts of heat and moisture as it headed toward the Cape Verde Islands. By the time it passed over Santiago at 2015 local time, it had already become a major Atlantic storm. Residents of the Cape Verde Islands have tightly closed their capital, Praia. At this time of year, they lived with such storms, but even they were surprised by the strength and power of the wind. By 11 p.m., the National Hurricane Center issued its first tropical storm warning. Then, around 3:30, the storm was named Susie. The fact that NOAA has nearly exhausted the alphabet showed what a year this has been for Atlantic hurricanes. As they tried to determine the storm's path, NOAA scientists also observed a rare dip in the westerly directional winds that typically steer these types of storms toward Mexico. Without these winds, the tendency of cyclone storms to move toward the Earth's poles has accelerated their northward movement. Initial GOES data indicated the target could range from Cuba to North Carolina. The weather this year was especially warm, so as Susie made her way across the Atlantic, she gained strength to the second category. Finally, around 5:30, one of NOAA's hurricane hunting lions obtained the storm's exact position and trajectory. The news was disappointing. Susie was already a fourth category and moving west. To make matters worse, when most hurricanes approach land, they tend to return to the ocean. Susie, on the other hand, was moving in a straight line towards the windward islands of Cuba and the Florida Keys. The last time a Category 4 hurricane directly hit the Keys was in 1935, killing more than 400 people. A NOAA C-130 aircraft broke through the leading edge of the hurricane and ended up in the eye of the hurricane. It was a beautiful day in the eye, completely surrounded by a hurricane wall. The pilot always considered this one of the strangest phenomena of a cyclone storm. The four Allison T-56 F-15 turboprop engines had nearly separated from the wing getting them there, and the pilot was in no mood for the return trip. But he found what he needed. Susie was truly a Category 4, and she was angry. As she began to advance on the Windward Islands and the southeast coast of Cuba, Susie finally began to veer north. She now had winds of 115 miles per hour, which dropped her to Category 3 on the Simpson scale. But that still meant that everything in its path would experience a 25-foot storm surge. The highest point in Key West is 18 feet above sea level, so most of this place will soon be underwater. And the storm itself was now moving much faster than predicted. I couldn't stay in Key West Harbor, not if I wanted to keep the boat. The only options were to put out to sea and outrun the storm, or try to weather it in the open ocean as far north as possible. The strongest effects were still predicted a day later. The closest, and by far the most logical, safe harbor was Marco Island. This is about 90 nautical miles north as the crow flies. This is approximately a 9 to 10 hour voyage on the engine. Given the time I had, I was confident that hiking north to Marco would bring me to a sheltered harbor well before dawn. The eye of the hurricane was forecast to be closer to Cuba, so I knew that would give me some respite. I didn't want to lose my boat. Her tanks were full of diesel fuel, and Marco was the obvious choice. So I immediately let go of the mooring lines and set a course east-north at 020 on the compass across the open ocean, straight to safety. The rest of the day was spent securing the boat. I closed all the cabinets and hatches and made sure everything that could move inside was secured. The sky was a strange bluish-white color with greenish hues and high clouds. The ocean was almost calm. It was calm before the storm. The Volvo diesel engine in my C&C was very powerful, and we cruised close to 10 knots in calm seas. This meant that, with luck, we arrived in Marco well before dawn. Too many times in my life have I looked back on such thoughts with grim irony. This was one of those cases. We were motoring to a point about 30 nautical miles south and west of Marco when the wind rose from the northeast to about 40 knots. We had been averaging 9 knots up to this point, but there was no way to move against the huge waves the increasing wind was throwing up. So in order to keep going, I had to deviate from the straight line and go closer to 045. Based on my calculations, I was heading towards an area south of Cape Romano. I could probably lay low in the Dismal Islands off the coast of Lake Okeechobee if things got worse. I knew I had gotten away from most of the hurricane's force, but not far enough. The waves were still killer. The sun had set 4.5 hours ago, and the waves were in the 10 to 12-foot range, crashing on the port side. I told Buster I wanted him in the cabin. He told me in his most eloquent dog language where I could shove my good intentions. So I put a life jacket on my brave but stubborn old friend, and together we went out into the storm. At that point, I closed the cabin, effectively making the boat waterproof no matter what hit it. The boat was riding a roller coaster ride through the waves, but was still holding relatively strong when the first of the really big waves hit us on the port side. We were in relatively shallow water at that point. I knew this because such waves are a consequence of depth. We rose maybe 15 feet and hit the bow, sinking the boat all the way to the bow. We surfaced back as soon as we hit the second wave. She was probably 20 feet tall. We went up and down, and this time the boat sank all the way to the cabin. We had to get water because I heard the pumps turn on. I tied both Buster and myself to the helm post using ropes to our life jackets. It was a good decision because Buster flew past me as we were diving, and if I hadn't secured him to something solid, he would have fallen overboard. He dusted himself off and said, "God im Himmel." Did I mention he was part Rottweiler? I held on to the helm for dear life and told him, "You're right, buddy." We continued like this for another hour. The waves were not breaking waves, but coil waves. We climbed to the ridge and then plunged 20 or 30 feet into the depression. The rain stung my face like pellets, even through my insulated storm jacket and goggles. Finally, I tied the helm. At that moment, control was impossible in any case. But my trusty old Volvo engine still gave us enough speed to stay on the course we were on. The wind was blowing so hard that I had to take shelter behind the cabin. This kind of rocking and waddling would be barely survivable in a 40-foot boat. But this is not something a sailing ship can withstand for long. Shortly afterwards, the entire main mast collapsed. I could see it coming when I heard the fastenings clicking one after another. Then the mother of all waves lifted us so high on the other side of the crest that the boat literally stood on its bow all the way to the cockpit, dragging the mast behind it. I was sure that the next wave would destroy us. Then I saw her. She stood in the center of the cockpit in her usual position, with one hand on her hip. She looked at me with that slight smile that I remembered so well. She was wearing the same outfit as the day she went for a run. It was as if she had been waiting for me, frozen in the moment since that fateful day. Strangely, the boat stopped rocking and the rain stopped. It was completely calm. Maybe we were in the eye of the storm. She walked slowly towards me with an adoring expression on her perfect face. She hugged my waist, as always, and looked at me with her incredible emerald eyes. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. She said with deep feeling, "I have been waiting for this moment for 50 years, my love, and now it has come." Then she raised her wonderful lips to mine, and we kissed. An indescribable world enveloped me. Our souls merged into one, and we became one spirit in an eternity of blinding light. My last thought was, so this is what it is, heaven. The hurricane had blown through during the night, and, as is often the case with cyclonic storms, the sky was now clear and bright. A Coast Guard Sikorsky 61R He-3549 helicopter from us Coast Guard Station, Islamorada, searched for survivors. They received a distress call from several ships in the area and were searching for survivors. Sea King was at the limit of its search quadrant when the crew saw a large debris field along with a lifeboat. The boat was completely closed. The S-61 went into a standard hover at 25 feet and the rescue diver was lowered. He unfastened the outer shell of the lifeboat and began to wave for lifting. The chief on-board technician lowered the rescue strap from the winch. The diver grabbed him. What followed was a surprising amount of fiddling around in the boat. It was even more surprising when the diver put his finger up to lift the passenger. The passenger was a large dog. She complained loudly all the way up to the helicopter. As she was being brought aboard, the chief technician noticed that she had one of those dry erase boards attached to her collar that divers use. On the board was written, "This is my dog Buster. Please take care of him. Now I'm with her." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. 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 Click to the next